change your heart to a little white dove. More than a feeling, that's the power of love. Hey. Tougher than diamonds, breaks like cream, stronger and harder than a bad girl's dream. Make a bad one good, make a wrong one right. Power of love will keep you home at night. Don't need money, don't take things, don't take no credit card to ride this train. It's strong and it's sudden and it's cruel sometimes, but it might just save your life. Help me out. That's the power of love. Hey. That's the power of love, yeah. First time you feel it, might make you sad. Next time you feel it, it might make you mad. But you'll be glad, baby, when you found that's the power makes the world go round. Hey. It don't take money, don't take fame, don't take no credit card to ride this train. It's strong and it's sudden, can be cruel sometimes, might just save your life. They say that all in love is fair, yeah, but you don't care. But you know what to do when it gets hold of you. And with a little help from above, you feel the power of love. Yeah, yeah, you feel the power of love. Can you feel it? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Come on, give Neil a hand this morning. Help me out one more time. Don't take money, don't take fame, don't need no credit card to ride this train. Tougher than diamonds and stronger than steel. You won't feel nothing till you feel it. You feel the power, you feel the power of love. That's the power, that's the power of love. You feel the power of love. You feel the power of love. You feel the power of love. Yeah, good morning, SCC. How we doing? Good. Hey, we are glad you're here. My name is Chris. I'm the worship pastor here at SCC. Hey, I'd love to invite you to stand to your feet this morning. We like to kind of start at a common place. And so if you're here in this room and you have not been to church, you may not know some of these songs that we sing, but we like to start with things that we can all kind of get into. So I hope you enjoyed that first one. We've got another song for you this morning. This one's a lot of fun, but I need some help, okay? Are you guys awake? It's 10:30? 10:30? I think it's late enough that we can kind of get into it. So if you know it, sing it loud, sing it proud. We are testifying to what God has done in our lives. And if you don't have that story, we kind of equate this to what it looks like when people get excited about sports or a raise or their kids succeeding in life. And so we want to share that with you. Sound good? All right, band, you ready? How we feeling, room? We ready? Online, are you ready? If you're ready, say yes, I'm ready in the chat. Let's give it a shot. All right, if you know it, I want loud voices. Hey! You're welcome to put your hands together as we sing. Yeah. Excuse me for a minute, but I've got a song to sing. It might not be on key, but it's from my heart. Oh, and no one else can tell it, yeah, what the Lord has done for me. This might take all day, so I better start right now, but it might get loud. Hey! might get loud. Heaven's coming down, down, down. It might get, hey, somebody say, it might get loud. Heaven's coming down, down, down. It might get loud. Come on now. Oh, I don't have a halo. No, I'm not a perfect man. I'm just glad to be a child of God. 'Cause when I think of where I could have been, should have been, would have been if you hadn't stepped in. Oh, I've got a praise on the inside that can't be denied, and I gotta get it out right now. It might get loud. It might get loud. Heaven's coming down, down, down. It might get loud. Help me out, sing it with me. It might get loud. Heaven's coming down, down, down. It might get loud. Let me hear you sing.
It might get loud.
Yeah. Heaven's coming down, down, down. It might get loud. One more time, sing it. It might get loud. Heaven's coming down, down, down. It might get loud. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, go. All right, we sing it together. Why can't I praise? Why can't I praise Him as loud as I want? Why can't I praise Him as loud as I want? Sing it with me. Why can't I praise? Why can't I praise Him as loud as I want? Heaven's coming down, 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 down. Why can't I praise Him as loud as I want? You guys ready? 2 more good ones. Come on. Why can't I praise Him as loud as I want? Why can't I praise Him as loud as I want? Why can't I praise Him as loud as I want? Why can't I praise Him as loud as I want? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Hey, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. One more time. Say, it might get loud. It might get loud. Heaven's coming down, down, down. It might get loud. Sing it out. It might get.
It might get loud.
Heaven's coming down.
Heaven's coming down, down, down.
Oh, it might get loud. Sing, why can't I praise Him? Say, why can't I praise Him as loud as I want? Why can't I praise Him? Why can't I praise Him as loud as I want? Why can't I praise Him as loud as I want? Give yourselves a hand this morning. Hey, take a seat. Why don't you check this out?
Well, good morning, everybody. It's so good to see all of you guys here today. So I actually have a question for you. How many of you guys would say that you have grit? Ooh, no? I love it. Well, see, I feel like grit's something we don't always think about. And in today's world, so many of us, we give up when things get hard.
Yeah.
And in Steamboat Kids, we believe that grit is something so important because grit is refusing to give up when life gets hard. So, Michaela, do you have grit?
I don't know, maybe sometimes?
Yeah, okay, me too. Well, if you are a parent to a first through fifth or a pre-K, we would love to see you at our family experience happening it's Saturday night, October 8th at 6 p.m. here, and we are going to be teaching you and your kids all about grit.
Yes, so Grit is actually one of our 36 life apps that Steamboat Kids teaches kids all about. And what's super cool about these life apps is that they apply to all kids, whether they're churchgoers or not. So this is a great opportunity for you to invite your kids as friends and their parents.
Totally. This is the event of the year for Steamboat Kids, and so we want you to be there. We're opening our doors at 5 p.m. We're going to have bouncy houses outside. It's going to be crazy. It's going to be fun. We have some things for parents, and also, parents, this is a cool opportunity for you to come join us and see what Steamboat Kids is about and how we want to partner with you, because ultimately, you have the most weeks. You have 936 weeks with your child. So obviously, there's more, but within the time between birth to 18. So we want to partner with you.
Oh man, I can't wait to get some Grit, Hadley. That sounds so cool.
that was actually, I need a little more grit than that.
Right. That was kind of weak. Let me try this again. Ready? I can't wait to get some grit, man.
Come on.
Yeah.
Okay. I love it.
Was that better?
Give her a round of applause.
That was better, right?
I love it. Well, if it is your first time here, we would love to meet you after this experience right over here. And also, you can go ahead and pull out your phone, scan the QR code in front of you, and it will help you find some ways to get connected.
Yes, so the rest of this morning's experience will be about 50 minutes long. We'll hear one more song and then get into this cool series called The Church.
Yeah, let's go. Let's go.
That's right. You guys still with us this morning? Ooh, no, you're not with us. Okay, so it is a little bit early still, kind of, but we're going to sing one more song. And we just had a ton of fun, right? We're jumping around, loud music. This song is kind of the opposite, and it's one of my favorites because it talks about the fact that a lot of times the church can pick up all these little details that will distract us from the main thing. We believe that the main thing is Jesus. And if you're here today and you are not a church veteran, if you haven't, I grew up in church, and you know, if you haven't been in that experience, we hope that what you're getting today is that we want to get away from all the details that separate us. We want to focus on the main thing. Does that sound good? All right. Hey, I'd invite you to stand to your feet. If you're not comfortable with that, you're welcome to sit and listen as we sing. But this song is something I think we can all sing together. I want to know you, Lord, like I know a friend. I want to know you, Lord. I want to know you, Lord, like I know a friend. I want to know you, Lord. We sing it together. I'm laying down. So I'm laying down all my religion. Yes, I'm laying down. I want to know you, Lord. Yes, I'm laying down all my religion. Yes, I'm laying down. I want to know you, Lord. I want to know you, Lord. And I used to think that I could box you in, but I'm laying down. I want to know you, Lord. Yes, I used to think that I could box you in, but I'm laying down. I want to know you, Lord. So I'm laying down all my religion. Yes, I'm laying down. I want to know you, Lord. Yes, I'm laying down all my religion. Yes, I'm laying down. want to know you, Lord. I want to know you, Lord. All right, we sing it one more time. Lord, I've been told to be ashamed. Lord, I've been told I don't measure up. Lord, I've been told I'm not good enough, but you're here with me. Can we sing it one more time? I'm laying down. So I'm laying down all my religion. Yes, I am. I'm laying down. I want to know you, Lord. Yes, I'm laying down all my religion. Yes, I'm laying down. One more time, just the voices. I'm laying down. So I'm laying down all my religion. Yes, I'm laying down. I wanna know. Yeah, let him hear you sing it. I'm laying down. Yes, I'm laying down all my religion. Yes, I'm laying down. I wanna know you, Lord. Yeah. That's what we're praying this morning. Every time we gather together, we're asking that God would continue to reveal more pieces of himself. And Pastor Troy talks about this a lot. I love it. But one of the mistakes that church has made is it makes it difficult sometimes. And the point of that song and the point of what we do here is that we believe it's easier to connect with God than doing all these things that ostracize us from being a part of this body of believers. So I want to thank you guys for singing with us. You may be seated. Check out this video.
Good to see you guys. Thanks for being here. My name is Troy, and just grateful. Hey, are the Broncos playing tonight? Who cares? Oh, who does care? Some of you? Good. I'm glad. Happy for you. Happy for myself. Last week, I don't get a chance to say this very often, and this might be the last time I get to say it, but the Dallas Cowboys won last week. So, yeah, whatever. Every time I mention my Cowboys, they lose, so they're going to lose today. And I don't know if it's because I mention it or they just suck, but I think it's the latter. Anyway, good morning, welcome, good to have you. Thanks for being here. Beautiful time in Steamboat, man. I love this month. I love this time of year. Pretty glad that you joined us anyway. Came out here. Those who are in person, those online, welcome. So if you're new with us this morning, we've been doing a series. We've been trying to answer a question. And it's kind of a strange question, but when you think about it, it is pertinent. And the question is this: how in the world did the church survive? You grew up in church. It just seemed like, sometimes what churches did, you're just like, really? How does this continue to happen? And the truth is that the church is one of the least popular institutions in the world today. We're not very well thought of, and we get a lot of bad press. And yet, during the first few centuries, the church grew. It spread like wildfire. I mean, it just exploded. And so the question is what happened back then? What made the church do that, and what have we missed? What are we not doing that we should be doing? Well, today, what we're going to be reading together, I believe will provide a big answer to this question. I think today is going to be a little bit of a turning point for us in this. And one of the things I've done in this series is I've made the case that church has changed over the years, and not always for the better. Originally, the church wasn't a place. The church wasn't a place. It wasn't something that you go to. The church originally was a movement. It was a movement of people. People who were committed to sharing a message that of Jesus, and they brought that to a world that was looking for hope. And so we've always thought that it was a place, but it's a movement. And over the centuries, unfortunately, the church has changed its focus from reaching and helping outsiders to taking care of the insiders. That's what churches have become about, is protecting us from the world and taking care of us. And I get it, it can be a refuge, but that's not how it started. It was out. Little by little, the church has become about control and priests and pastors and pews and hymnals and buildings. But as we've seen over the last few weeks, the early church didn't start out like that. Actually, the early church started out on the streets of Jerusalem. Apparently, about 2 months after Jesus was crucified and put to death publicly, hundreds of people flooded the streets of Jerusalem, claiming that Jesus was alive, that they had seen him. And within a few weeks, over 10,000 people had embraced this message of hope, that death had been defeated. And suddenly, the control that the Roman leaders and the Jewish religious leaders had over the people, that became tenuous, it became threatened, and so they wanted to do something about it. And last week we read that the leaders of this Jesus movement were repeatedly arrested and warned not to mention that name anymore. Don't talk about Jesus. And we saw that they were even beaten and whipped to the point of death, told, stop this. But it didn't stop them. Luke, who, by the way, was a first century physician, doctor, and he's also a historian. And he interviewed and investigated a lot of these things happen and collected it into two letters he wrote. One was called The Gospel According to Luke. He didn't name it that. It's become known as that. And the second was the Acts of the Apostles, or the early church history. And he collected this and looked at this, and he tells us in Acts chapter 5, verse 41, that after the apostles had been arrested and stood before the Sanhedrin and told to shut up, and then they were whipped, flogged, that they left the Sanhedrin rejoicing. They were pumped. They were high-fiving each other because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. In other words, they were honored to suffer in the same way that he suffered, which is strange. And then he goes on, Luke says this, that day after day, in spite of the warnings, in the temple courts and from house to house, they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus was the Messiah. These people weren't afraid of anything. They weren't afraid of dying. They had seen Jesus beaten and whipped and put to death. He was dead. They saw that, and then they saw him alive. And then they're like, well, what do we got to be afraid of if that's in our camp, we got it. So anyway, as this movement grew, some new leaders kind of stepped to the forefront, and it kind of changed the trajectory of this thing to another level. One of those leaders was a guy by the name of Stephen, and in Acts chapter 6, you can read about Stephen, and you can read how he was arrested, and he was brought before the Sanhedrin, which was, like I said, the Supreme Court of Israel. And he was told to shut up, and witnesses were brought, and they were paid off to kind of say that Stephen said some things he never said. And in Acts chapter 7, the whole chapter, Stephen kind of just stands up and gives a defense of what he's doing and why. And when he finished, the religious leaders that were there became so angry that they dragged him outside one of the city gates. The city was a walled city, and there were several gates. Actually, they drug him outside the gate called Beautiful, which is the irony of this, and they stoned him to death. He became the first Christian martyr. He became the first follower of Jesus to die for what he had seen, for his faith. And this changed everything. The floodgates were open. The dominoes fell. Luke tells us that his death kind of emboldened the opponents of this new Jesus movement, and they just went nuts. He says this, on that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and the disciples were scattered all throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles kind of stayed there, which is interesting. And New Testament scholars have kind of always debated, why did they stay? Why did they stay? Especially in light of what Jesus told them to do. Remember, Jesus told those guys very specifically, go into the world. Go to the world and tell them, and they stayed. So we're not sure why. But Luke adds one small little detail to this Stephen stoning story that becomes a big deal later on. It says this in Acts chapter 8, verse 1. It says, and Saul approved of their killing Stephen. Now, Saul is just the Hebrew version of the Greek and Roman name Paul. Sound a little familiar? So Saul okayed the murder. And in verse 2, it says this, that godly men then buried Stephen, and they mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church, destroy the ecclesia. Remember we talked about this? The word for church, the Greek word for church was ecclesia, which means a gathering of people. In about the 3rd or 4th century, though, that word got mistranslated to Kirche, a German-based word, or Kirche, which means a gathering place. So the church went from being a people to a place. But it started out as a people. And so Paul began to destroy, not a building, but a movement. A gathering of people. The ecclesia, he terrorized them. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. Paul started a full court press persecution, man. He was on it. His mission was to wipe the church out. He thought that he was doing God a favor. And Luke says this, that this went on unchecked for 3 years. I mean, just hundreds of Christians were put in prison and even put to death. And as you imagine, everywhere Saul went, Christians left. They scattered, which had some kind of unintended consequences. What Saul didn't realize was that he was causing the message of Jesus to be spread throughout to the countryside and even outside the borders of Palestine. So this is what Jesus said, that go into the world, and persecution forced that. And so here's the thing, I'm about to transition. After 3 years of intense persecution, something incredible happened. No one could see this coming, least of all Saul. And here's the beginning of our story today. It says this in Acts chapter 9, verse 1. Luke says, meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. And he went to the high priest, who was the big wig there in Jerusalem, and he asked him for a letter to the synagogues in Damascus, saying that if he found any Christians there who belonged to the way. That's interesting. If he found any there who belonged to the way, whether they were men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. So he's getting permission to go outside of Palestine and go chase down these people. What's interesting is that at this point in history, Christians weren't known as Christians. Did you catch that? The movement was known as the way. And again, scholars have kind of wondered why the way. And they came up with a theory, and I think it's pretty good. And the theory goes like this, that Jesus often taught that the way to God was simple, but it was narrow. Remember he said there's a wide road, and then there's a narrow road. And then he said this, he said, I am the way. I am the life and the truth, and no one goes to the Father except through me. Now, only a crazy person would say, if you want to find God, you got to go through me. But we know this, that most religions say that if you want to find God, you got to do this. And you got to do that. That's what all religion is about, is doing, right? But Jesus, one of his messages was that the days of doing are done. That you can't do it. You can't earn your way to this thing. In fact, Jesus said all of that doing stuff is finished. He said, it is finished. It is done. Jesus did it. And so, finding God was now as simple as finding Jesus. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father, he said. And so this was so central to his teaching that this movement became known as the Way. Isn't that cool? Okay, if you're a geek like me, you think that's cool. I think it is. Anyway, I'm a nerd on that. But anyway, so Saul gets permission to go to Damascus and arrest any Christians that he finds and to allow him to drag them back to Jerusalem to try them and maybe put them to death. But God had other plans. And here we go. Here's the crux. Here's the thing that happens. In verse 3, it says this. As Saul neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light flashed around him. And he fell to the ground, and he heard a voice, and the voice said to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Well, of course, Saul's like, who are you, or what are you? and the voice said, I am Jesus. I am Jesus, the one whom you are persecuting. In other words, you persecute my people, you persecute me. This is the body. We represent him. Jesus was the visible representation of an invisible God on earth, and we now are the visible representation of Jesus on earth. We are the hands and feet of Jesus. And so he's like, you're persecuting me. And then he says, now I want you to get up and I want you to go back into the city and there you will be told what you must do. And so Saul gets up off the ground and he realizes that he's blind, that he can't see, that he's been blinded by the light, revved up like a deuce, another runner. I'm sorry. You know that song, don't you? The old 70s. Some of you don't. Go Google that. Anyway, that's where the phrase came from, blinded by the light. And so Saul stands up, and the people around him take him by the arm, and they lead him into Damascus. For 3 days, Saul stays at someone's house, and he's perplexed. He's wondering, what has just happened to me, man? What's going on? What am I going to do now? I mean, what? He was pretty clear about his vision for his life, and now it's all upside down. His world has been turned upside down. What's interesting is at the same time, in another place in Damascus, another man is having his world rocked. In verse 10, it says this, that in Damascus there was a disciple, another follower of Jesus, named Ananias. The Lord called to him in a vision, said, Ananias. And he's like, yes, Lord. And the Lord said to him, I want you, get this, I want you to go to the house of Judas over on Straight Street. I love that God is specific. I want you to go to 2932 Straight Street. Does God talk to you like that? And I also love the fact that Luke includes this in there because a good historian will add details like this and be specific. Why? Because that would verify the story, allows you to go verify if it's true. Is there really a straight street? You can, in fact, there's still a straight street today in Damascus. You can go there. The street's still there. So he puts that in there, and he says, I want you to go to the house of Judas over at Straight Street, 2339 Straight Street, and I want you to ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he is praying. And Ananias goes, whoa, that name sounds familiar. Saul. He goes, Lord, in verse 13, I have heard a lot of reports about this guy and all the harm that he has done to your people over in Jerusalem. And now he's come here with authority from the chief priests to arrest all who are calling on your name. In other words, God, this guy has come here looking to kill people like me. And now you want me to go looking for him? No, thank you. But the Lord said to Ananias, go. This man, get this, look at this. This man is my chosen instrument. This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and to their leaders and to the people of Israel. Now Ananias hears this. He's like, chosen instrument. A murderous Pharisee is your guy. Lord, this Saul is one of the most judgmental, religious people in all of Israel. I mean, that makes him kind of the most religious, judgmental people in the world. Because there's a lot of those folks in Israel at that time. And you're telling me that you have chosen him to take your message of love and grace and forgiveness to the world? That doesn't make sense, Lord. And God's like, exactly. That's right. After all that this guy has done to Christians, when he starts preaching for Jesus instead of against him, the world cannot doubt that it was me that called him. Because he has flipped. He was the most anti-Christ person, and all of a sudden, so it's a brilliant plan. It really is. And then God says this in verse 16. He's like, oh, by the way, Ananias, I'm going to tell him how much he's going to suffer for my name. I'll tell him that part. And at some point, apparently God told Saul what would happen to him. But we'll get to that in a second. So Ananias goes over to Judas's house, and I can just imagine him kind of walking slowly up the sidewalk. And he gets up on the porch, and he's about to knock, and he's just like thinking, the man inside this house is responsible for killing people I know. I mean, he has dragged innocent men and women from their homes, and no one has heard from him since. What am I doing here? And so, needless to say, Ananias cautiously and gently knocks on the door there. And the door opens, and Ananias steps inside, and there he is. Psycho Saul of Tarsus. Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal the cannibal, I don't know. I mean, he's sitting in a chair. He's got this mask now. He's sitting there, and there's a blank look on his face. I mean, it's might be even dark. And it becomes clear to Ananias, this guy's blind. Can't see. And so Ananias gently places his hands on Saul's eyes, and then he says a simple prayer, and immediately Saul regains his sight. And then Ananias tells Saul what God told him, and Saul can't believe what his ears and his eyes have heard and seen. And he's just like, wow, this is too much. And in fact, Luke tells us that Saul spent several days staying with the disciples there in Damascus. I mean, he's probably processing. He's just like, whoa. And I imagine that the Christians in the area kind of one at a time came over to the house, to where Saul was and peeking in the window. And it's like, oh my God. He's in there. And others looking in there and like, well, he don't look so tough to me, And then they knock on the door and they run off. I don't know. I don't think that's in your Bible. It's in mine. But in verse 20, we get this announcement, this verse that is absolutely shocking. It says this: suddenly Saul began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus was the Son of God. This shocked the world. They're like, no way. It would be like you and I 20 years ago opening up a newspaper and the headline reading, Osama bin Laden converts to Christianity. I mean, Saul was a terrorist. And we wouldn't believed it. We were like, really? I don't know if I buy this. And they didn't either. There were people, same with Saul. In verse 21, it says that all who heard this were astonished. And they asked, isn't this the guy who's been terrorizing, raising havoc, creating chaos down in Jerusalem among those who call on his name? And hasn't he come up here to do the same, to take these people prisoners back to the chief priests? And it was. And in verse 22, this is kind of the summary line. It says, yet Saul grew more and more bold, and he baffled the Jews living there in Damascus by proving to them that Jesus was the Messiah. He took the scriptures and said, let me connect the dots. Now, this is kind of, the narrative kind of stops here for a second. And I just want to, for a moment, give you some history, and I want to flash forward because I want to make a point. And so you may not know this, but for the next 10 or 12 years, Saul kind of disappears. All of this lead up, and all of a sudden Saul kind of falls off the earth a little bit. I mean, he shows up here and there. We see him say something here and there, but he essentially goes underground. And what we're told, what we think and assume is that Saul is studying. Saul is learning. He's learned how to make tents. He becomes a tent maker. He's studying. He gets out his old scrolls. And I imagine he's looking at the verses and the passages regarding the Messiah. And he's connecting the dots. And on every page in the Old Testament, he's seeing Jesus clearly. And we know this, that in his letter that he writes to the Galatians, that he said that he went and visited Peter for several weeks, stayed with Peter and talked to them and processed with Peter and James, the half-brother of Jesus. And we know that he went to Jerusalem and he met with many of the disciples, and he learned about Jesus' life. He learned about Jesus. And then, after 12 years later, when he's ready, Saul emerges. He gets on a boat and it leaves Jerusalem. And he embarks on what historians now call the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul. He goes on a cruise, 4 cruises around the Mediterranean, man. Sounds pretty exciting, but it wasn't. It was dangerous, and it was incredibly risky. And over the next decade, Saul, whose name becomes Paul, travels all over the Mediterranean. He goes deep into, look at that map, he goes deep into Turkey and all over Greece, right? And he's spreading this message of hope, of Jesus. And during this time, he plants dozens of little ecclesias, little gatherings of people all over the world. I mean, and it's fascinating. At the same time that he's doing this, the other apostles are in Jerusalem down there in the bottom right corner, and they're just trying to plant one. It's as if Paul's saying, listen, you guys take Jerusalem, and I'll take the rest of the world. I'll do the rest of this. And he did. He went everywhere, and he talked to everyone he could. And he had a method to his madness. It was interesting. Whenever Paul got to a new city, the first thing that he would do is go to the synagogue in that city. And he would walk in, he'd pull out his Jew card. You know, I'm a Pharisee, had his robes on, and they're like, oh my gosh, Saul, yes, come. Tell us the latest from Jerusalem. Tell us what God is saying. And Paul would get up in front of him and say, hi. He's like, I have great news for you. God has brought an end to all of the religion that you and I have been practicing all these years. It's over. Yeah, he sent his son Jesus, and Jesus came with a new covenant. A new covenant, and it has replaced the old covenant. You remember the old covenant? Moses came down from the Mount Sinai. Here's a new covenant, and that old covenant had 10 commandments that we've turned into 600 laws. Well, that's all over. That's done. And the new covenant just has one commandment. In fact, you don't have to do anything, but it just has one commandment, and that commandment is to love one another as Jesus loved you. Which in some ways is very simple, but maybe harder than all that other stuff, right? That's why we love religion, because we can put God in a box and we can kind of control, and I know what I'm doing. But boy, having to love you and you and you like Jesus loved me, that can be tough. But that's the commandment. That's what he did. But anyway, and when you do that, by the way, you actually fulfill all the other commandments. You won't steal, you won't murder, you won't commit adultery. You'll care about people at a deeper level. Anyway, sometimes these synagogues loved what they heard, and they're like, Paul, Saul, tell us more. Sometimes they didn't, and they would beat him. He was arrested. He was dragged outside city gates. He was stoned. I mean, he was beaten up. He got mistreated. And so when that would happen, he would kind of dust off his feet, and he'd go on to another city. And he went to all the major cities like Corinth and Athens and Ephesus. And he often wrote letters to the people that he met in these places. For example, before he put that up, once while he was back in Jerusalem, he was arrested. He was down in Jerusalem on one of these journeys, and he was arrested again. And since Paul was a citizen of Rome, he was a Jew, but he was also a Roman citizen, he made an appeal that I want to be tried by Rome. I want to be tried in Rome. I want to take this thing to the center of the world. And so they put him on a boat, and it took him 2 long years to get to Rome. It took a long time. In fact, he got shipwrecked on Malta. Had a shipwreck there, stayed there for a few months, got bit by a snake, and he kind of shook the snake off, a poisonous snake. And there's a story about all the people are like, OMG, you must be a god. And he's like, no, but let me tell you about God. And he used it. And anyway, it took him 2 long years. And when he got to Rome, he spent another 2 years in house arrest. He couldn't leave, waiting to have his appeal before the emperor. And here's the thing. It was during those years that he wrote his letters to the Ephesians and to the Philippians and to the Colossians. Those are known as the prison epistles. And so, let me get to the story here. After 2 years in Rome, he was released. They just kind of let him go. He never got a chance to testify. But in 66 AD, Paul was arrested again, and this time he was thrown in a dungeon in Rome, a real jail, a dark one, pretty rough one. And this was not house arrest. And Nero was the emperor at that time, and we're all familiar of Nero's fondness for Christians. So one day in 67 AD, probably very early in the morning before Rome had woken up, Paul's cell door was opened up, and some Roman guards came in and they helped him up and they escorted him out. He was probably 60 years old at this time. They quietly walked to a place just outside the city gates, and without any ceremony and with no eyewitnesses, Paul was beheaded. Done. Paul's life came to an abrupt and sudden ending. This adventure came to an end. And but it's interesting. His impact was just beginning. His impact on the world was just starting. Some of you are like, how is that possible? Well, here's what I mean. While Paul spent all that time in prisons and on boats, he was writing letters to these little ecclesias, and those letters now make up more than half of our New Testament, and very important letters. And here's one of the reasons why they're important. Now, don't miss this. Those letters helped clarify what Jesus meant to us Gentiles. I mean, as you know, Jesus was a Jew. He was born to the nation of Israel. He was a full-on Jew. He's a rabbi. He was born under the law in order that he might fulfill it. That was one of his missions, was to close that chapter and fulfill it, to do what no one else could do. Live it out. Be perfect. And he was. And he closed that chapter, and but he was Jewish. And a Jew could understand how Jesus might be this long-awaited Messiah that they had been looking for thousands of years. And they can understand what Jesus did for them. But a Gentile would be like, what's a Messiah? And what's this law? What law are you talking about here? And what does Jesus have to do with me? And so, get this. Unlike all the other apostles that were back in Jerusalem, who were mostly blue-collar workers and fishermen, Paul was an incredibly educated man. Highly educated. I mean, he was one of the brightest Pharisees. He was also a Roman citizen, so he'd studied abroad. He worked, and he probably traveled the world. So he's a man of the world. And so, this is my point. Paul was uniquely qualified to extract from or to extrapolate from this Judeo-Christian story that had been in works for thousands of years, what was essential to be communicated to the Gentiles. He could look at that and go, what, in other words, he helped those who didn't have an Old Testament background and those who weren't looking for a Messiah. He helped them understand what the gospel of Jesus was, what it was really about. And that's what Paul did. He looked at this and translated it. He like you and I, have the same opportunity every day to translate what we know about Jesus to a world that doesn't know Jesus. They know the church, they know religion, but they don't know Jesus. And so we have the same thing. And so Paul was like, what's the bottom line to this thing? What is the essence of this message? What does a person need to know in order to know God? These are the questions Paul answered for us. And in case you don't know what he came up with, I thought what I would do is I'd close by just reading you a short little passage from his first letter to the Corinthian church. And in this short passage, don't miss this, Paul gives us the crux of the gospel. This is good for us to know. In other words, what is it that we need to know? And he does it in just 4 quick thoughts. Let me give it to you. In chapter 15, verse 1 of 1 Corinthians, he says, now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel, of the good news that I preached to you, which you received, and you are now taking your stand. You're putting your hope on this. Remember, he had visited there, and he's writing to these people that he knew. And then he says this, he says, for what was given to me, what I learned during those 10 or 12 years as I dug into this, I have passed on to you as of first importance. In other words, here's the most important thing you need to know. And if you forget everything else I tell you, and Paul could go on and on and on, right? He says, in fact, one time Paul was preaching and someone fell asleep and they fell out of a 2-story window. Do you know this is in the Bible? Some of you are like, I know exactly how that guy feels. No, come on, hang with me. He said, this is what you need to know. If you forget everything else I tell you, don't forget this. And then he goes into it. First of all, Christ died for our sins. And that's how the scriptures predicted. And he was buried, which is important because that proves that he was dead, right? That's how we know that he was dead. You don't bury live people, you bury dead people. And everybody thought he was dead, and he was dead. And then it goes, and that's a big and, because there's usually no and to when you say someone has been buried. It's usually, and he was buried, period. That was the end. But on this case, he says, and he was raised from the dead on the 3rd day, just as the scriptures predicted. And then he appeared to Peter and to the 12, And after that, get this, he appeared to more than 500 of his followers at one time. Bet you didn't know that. 500 people, similar crowd like this. One time, he appeared to that. And then it says this, most of whom are still living. I love the fact that he pulled that in there. Because he's basically, he put that in there as a challenge. This was written about 50 AD, which is about 20 years after that event happened. And he's telling the Corinthians, look, I get it. I understand that this resurrection thing is hard to, believe. I get it. But you need to know this, that there are over 500 people who saw him with their eyes. And so if you don't believe me, you can buy a ticket and get on a ship and you can go to Jerusalem and you can find most of these people. They're still living today. You can go talk to them and they'll tell you what they saw. And then Paul names names. He's like, James. James, he appeared to James and he appeared to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me, as one who has been born at the wrong time. In other words, I kind of came late to the party. I get it. And then Paul makes this admission, and you can almost hear his heart, and it says that he goes, for I am the least of the apostles, and I don't even deserve to be called an apostle. And the Corinthians would go, well, why would you say that, Paul? I mean, you're freaking traveling all over the world, man. You've spent 12 years of your life traveling to dangerous places and sharing this message of Jesus at the risk of your life. Why would you say that you're the least of the apostles? And he goes, I don't deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church. I killed people for their faith, for what they believed, what they saw. I tortured people because of this name. Religion made me crazy. But then he says grace. He says this in verse 10. He says, but by the grace of God, I am what I am now. And God's grace wasn't wasted on me. I'm running with this. I'm picking up the pieces and I'm moving forward. In other words, Paul is saying, I love this. Paul is saying, look, man, God is using my past, my troubled past, to change people's future. God's using my disasters to bring life to other people. Now, here's my point. Paul was God's chosen instrument, quote, to help people who didn't have a religious background understand God's plan for the world. In this passage, Paul identifies 4 very simple truths, and these truths are core to the Christian faith. I mean, they're core. We talk about a lot of things, but this is it. Paul said these are of first importance. In other words, the bottom line to this whole thing, what you've got to know is, number 1, that Jesus died for your sins. Number 2, he was buried in a grave. Number 3, he was raised to life. And number 4, he appeared to hundreds of people, lots of people. Maybe it'd be good for us to repeat that. Would you read that with me? Jesus died for our sins, was buried in a grave, he was raised to life, and he appeared to a lot of people. It's as if, think about this. It's as if Paul is saying, look, guys, I know the Bible can be confusing. I know it can be difficult. There's a lot of stories and you're trying to connect. And I know that it can be even hard to believe. I mean, that 6 days creation thing, the flood, Jonah being swallowed by a fish, if you say so. But here's the thing. The one thing that you've got to know, the one thing that you've got to believe, you got to believe, the one thing that is of first importance is that Jesus died and he was buried and he was raised from the dead, and there were a lot of people that saw that. That's it. That's the foundation. That is the starting point of faith, by the way. That is it. If you're here and you're trying to decide whether or not Christianity is true or not, and you're wrestling with that, let me give you some advice. Number 1, don't go to church. We're going to mess it up for you. And don't look at what the church has done throughout the centuries. Oh, and don't look at us. Seriously, don't look at us and our lives and the way we're living, because it ain't testifying to some of this, right? And don't focus on the fact that, don't focus on those who have disappointed you and have let you down. Maybe when you grew up, you were raised in a family and you were raised to be a Christian, and then your parents got a divorce after your dad ran off with another woman. All those things, don't focus. All that stuff is a distraction. If you want to know God, start right here. Did Jesus die for my sins? Was he buried? And was he raised from the dead? And did people see him? That's it. Because that is the message that Paul took to the world. That was it. And now 2,000 years later, 2/3 of the world now say Jesus. That's the name, that Jesus is their Lord. And that's how this thing blew up, right here. And so I hope you've investigated that. That's what you need to be digging in on. If you're wrestling with this, I hope that you've investigated that yourself. And I know that you probably have a lot of other questions about God that you want answered, and I get it, and about the Bible and all that. But the real question, the one that is of first importance, is this. Do you believe that Jesus died for your sins and that God raised him from the dead? Because there were witnesses to that. And many of them gave their lives testifying that they had seen him alive. And they were in a unique position to know whether that was true. They were there. And it's pretty compelling when you think about it. I mean, Peter gave his life. He was crucified. And they told him, listen, we're going to crucify you if you don't shut up about Jesus. And he's like, do it. And so they're like, okay, we're going to crucify you. Any last requests? And Peter's like, yeah, I have one more. And they're like, are you going to stop talking about Jesus? He's like, no. Would you crucify me upside down? I'm not worthy to be crucified like my Lord. That was what you want? James, the brother of Jesus, testified and was put to death. I mean, and think about this. I mean, seriously, what would it take for your brother to prove to you that he was the Son of God? A lot for me. And for a while, James didn't believe it. He's like, no, I'm not buying it. My brother just has this Messiah complex, whatever. And suddenly, he believed. All of a sudden, he believed because he saw something. He saw something. He was never the same. And he believed, and he started telling about it. And he didn't gain anything from that. In fact, he died a brutal death. James was thrown off the temple by the religious leaders. Threw him off. And he didn't die. And so the religious leaders came down and they picked up stones and they stoned him to death while he prayed for them. And then Paul, who was just this freako, psycho, nut case going after Christians, terrorizing them, was committed to stopping this thing with everything inside of him. He wasn't paid. It was all about something that was going on, and he was doing it. And all of a sudden, one day, he wasn't doing it. And all of a sudden, the next day, he was doing something else. Complete opposite. And he gave his life so that the world would know. So that people like us would know. So that you and you would know what it takes to get to God. I don't know where you are on this. And maybe you're kind of 45% or 30%. Man, we can go over this and over and this, over and this. But there's only one way that you can know if Jesus is alive, and that's to ask him to show himself to you. Because he said, ask. He said, seek, and you'll find. And so you're like, well, how do I do that? Well, 33 years ago, September 17th, 1989, I was kind of in that position. I was about 30%. Okay, I think maybe. And so I said a little prayer. I said, and you know what? Things have kind of changed for me. I didn't expect. And I'm not saying God will turn you into a fat, bald preacher. I'm just saying I know some things now. I've tasted and seen. And so it starts maybe with a little prayer. So let me read you just one little line from Paul's letter to the Romans. And it's so small and so simple, but it's so clear. He said this to the Gentile believers, to people like you and I, in Romans 10:9. He said, if you say with your mouth that Jesus is your Lord, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Finding the way to God is simple. It's so simple. God made it so simple. Look to Jesus. Ask Jesus to show himself. And he'll show you. You'll see. And so I thought I'd say a prayer with you and give you an opportunity to pray. And you can pray. I'm going to say some words. You can pray your own words. But according to Saul, this is what we can do next. See what God will do. Would you bow your heads with me, Matt? Hey, God, I believe. I believe that Jesus died for my sins. John said that he was the Lamb of God who came to take away the sins of the world. And so I believe that he died for my sins. He took my punishment. And I believe that he was buried, that he was dead. No one disputes that. That he was dead and buried. He was beaten pretty mercilessly. And I believe that you have the power and that you could raise him back from the dead if you wanted to show us that death was no longer a thing or the thing. And I believe that these guys, I'm a historian, I know the stories. I believe that they saw you, because I see changes in Peter and I see changes in Paul, and there's no other way to explain it. So they saw you. And so, Lord, I want to see you. And so I ask that you would show yourself to me. Show Jesus to me. Help me to see that he's alive and that I have hope, and that you would save me, that you would help me in whatever I'm going through. And that whenever I call on your name, I would see your hand in the circumstances of my life. I ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen. Amen. Wow, if you said that prayer and you meant it, get ready. Look. I have a feeling God will show himself to you in a powerful way. Hey, I want to thank you guys for coming. Just quick announcement, 2 of them. If you're here this morning and you need some help, you're in trouble, that's what we're here for. We're not about the insiders. We're about the outsiders. If you're like, well, this isn't my church, hey, we're here for you. We want to help. And so myself and some of my friends from Kaya, we hang out down here. We'd love to pray with you and help you in any way we can. Number 2, if your first time is here, we'd love to get a chance to meet you. Rini, she has a gift for you down here. It's just a bribe to get you to come and tell us your name. But it's a cool thing. We'd love to get to know you seriously on that, okay? Did you have a good day at church? Yes. Me too. Go into the world. We'll see you guys next week. Amen.